Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to our webinar today. I happen to be the chairperson of Gayaa Dhuwi, Proud Spirit Australia, and I welcome you to this event. My name is Helen Milroy. I'm a Palku woman from the Pilbara region in Western Australia. I'm the Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the Perth Children's Hospital, and I'm really glad to be speaking about this topic, which is very close to my heart, and that's the wellbeing of children. Just going to get the technology started. Hopefully this will all go to plan. So let's just share my screen and get the presentation underway. So today I'm going to be talking about good beginnings, starting with the right story, which is really about trying to embed all of those good things that we want to help our children flourish throughout life. And of course, that's what we had years ago, prior to colonisation. We had thousands and thousands of years of living within the landscape with very, thriving communities as well as flourishing children. So let's have a think about what we need to do to get back to that state. And I hope you'll enjoy the presentation. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge our elders, past, present, and emerging, for their custodianship of the beautiful lands I happen to be on today. I'm on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people here in Boorloo in Perth. And my goodness, what a beautiful country it is to live on. Even though my homelands are in the Pilbara, I do love living down on Whadjuk Noongar Budja. And I also pay respects to the traditional custodians on all the lands we're meeting throughout Australia today. And aren't we lucky to live in such a beautiful country? So there's X marks the spot. That's where my grandmother's country is, and that's where my mob are from. Just want to make the comment about wellbeing in general, and that is that we get a lot of our generational learning and wellbeing really from our ancestors, from our families, our mothers and grandmothers, our fathers and grandfathers. And so as my grandmother holds my mum and my mum holds me and I hold my child and then my children's children, so my grandchildren, that's the way we learn about wellbeing. That's how we develop those safe, nurturing relationships, and that's how we hand down our parenting skills. And that's how it should be. But of course, this was disrupted on a historical, what happened to us historically and that unresolved historical legacy that we're still dealing with today. So what we really went through in terms of the magnitude of trauma was genocide. And this has left a lot of issues in our mental health and challenges for our families today, particularly with the fragmentation of families. So if we think about the present state, we've got trauma upon trauma. We've got the historical trauma. We've had recent trauma with the COVID pandemic, and then global traumas around the world with different conflicts as well as climate change. So it feels like currently we're always in crisis. In fact, they've coined a new term called permacrisis to actually explain that sense of pervasive anxiety about what's going to happen to our future. So how do we bring up children to flourish in a state that is like this, in a world that is like this? And of course, if we look at the triad of trauma and what happens to families and individuals and communities, there's a sense of powerlessness, that we can't control what's happening to us. There's a sense of helplessness. Is anyone going to be around to help me recover from all of these things? And that sense of hopelessness, which is about that disconnection and that sense of futility in life. So let's have a think about how that's impacted on us and then how we get out of that state of affairs. So at the moment, if we look at the First Nations context, we're still focusing on the deficit, what was broken and what needs to be fixed, instead of understanding that life is a much bigger context than just what's wrong, that we want to build in these social and emotional wellbeing models to actually help us to heal rather than just think about this kind of deficit focused approach. We still have a lot of racism in our services, that we don't have a lot of cultural safety in it or collaborative models in our services either. We still don't have traditional healing as part of our care unless we access that separately. We rely far too much on a cognitive science instead of understanding that the science of wellbeing is far broader than changing our thinking. We also want to focus to a strengths-based approach rather than feeling like we remain in that hopeless or helpless state. We also want to bring in our ways of knowing, being and doing, which kept us well for many, many thousands of years. In fact, our social and emotional well-being was part of life. What we had learned from living in the landscape for many generations was ways of knowing and being and doing, which kept us flourishing. So let's get back to that state. And I also think that we have to understand that we are in quite a different landscape now post the voice referendum, and that has actually allowed a sort of more overt racism to occur in our services. I also think there's a general lack of imagination and creativity and innovation in the way we deliver our services as well, particularly for children. So, if we think about social and emotional well-being, then sometimes it's reduced to a sort of list of, protective and risk factors, whereas in actual fact, it's a much broader notion than that. But if you also look at where the risks are, mostly they are in early childhood, and by far the most common risks to our social emotional well-being and our mental health is adverse childhood experiences. So if a lot of things go wrong and children face a lot of adversity in early life, that sets up a very bad pathway for trauma, and then that manifests later on down the track, often in early adolescence, as quite severe disorders or illness, self-harm, drug use, criminality, all of those other sorts of things that essentially are about being off track in development. And if we try and intervene later in life, it's much more costly and much more difficult to do. And if we think about our young people, where government is spending a lot of money now investing in youth, we have to say, how did they fare in the early years? Could we have intervened earlier? And the answer is yes, we could have and we should have, but we're not investing in the early part of life where these things start to go wrong, where we have a chance to build in recovery and healing in a much easier and a much more long-term way. If we get kids right in the early years, they're going to be pretty happy and healthy for most of their life course, and they can survive adversity if they have to face it down the track. So, the science of early childhood tells us that this is a time of considerable risk, but also wonderful opportunity. And if we get the brain architecture right in early life, it actually protects us even in our old age. So, let's put more effort into the early years. What do we need to do? If we think about the brain's response to adversity or experience, its greatest capacity to change is in the early years. By the time you're hitting 10 and above, the reduction is significant. In fact, it reduces even much earlier than that. I'm right down the other end of the spectrum. It's a bit hard to change my brain now, but I just hope all of that sort of good mental health that I built up in my early years and all my brain architecture that occurred back then has held me in good stead and will continue to hold me in good stead as I age. And the effort required to change brain architecture is much, much greater as we age into adolescence and adulthood. If we think about the way trauma and development go together, or they shouldn't go together really, trauma impacts on every aspect of child development. And in particular, it disrupts learning, memory, our ability to think clearly and understand others. It impacts on our behaviour and our emotions, and it also impacts significantly on how we develop our relationships. So, given that so much trauma we're still dealing with, that transgenerational trauma we're still dealing with from history, we have to make sure that we build in an understanding of this as we move forward in trying to develop really good, healthy, strong children. We still have to come to terms with the magnitude of what happened in order to move forward in a healthy way. If we ignore it, then we're possibly not putting in the effort that's required to overcome this transgenerational impact and get back to where we want to be, which is flourishing communities and children. The other issue about trauma is it sets up this triad that the world is a dangerous place, that people cannot be trusted, and life is unpredictable. And if we start to feel like that in early life, then the future at some point will become very tenuous, and that's when we start to feel hopeless. And our views about ourselves are that we are damaged or incompetent or at fault in some way, and that also makes life less enjoyable. These sorts of things then give you a shortened sort of future prospect. You don't see the point in living a long life. And this is where we start to develop suicidality. These things can start occurring very young in life if adversity is great enough. So at the moment, we're all speeding up in this very fast world that we live in. But are we taking the time to think about what's required in childhood to develop the sort of skills in order to cope with this ever-changing world and increasing stress that we're dealing with in our families? Do we take the time to think about our own healing? There's always storms raging around us. there will be for a long, long time to come. We are not going to be at peace in the world for a long, long time. So how do we take the time out of our busy lives to think about what our families need, what our children need? Where do we have those pivotal moments in our life where we can slow down to heal and make sure that we allow those times for our children as well? Sometimes children go from one thing to another. They're full of lessons and they have a scheduled life. Where's their time to play and be imaginative, to just be out in nature, to just be still? Are they allowed to just be? Because this is really important for our child development in the future. So, some of the key strategies in childhood in terms of focusing on developmental and educational outcomes is to actually think about those other outcomes that we also need. We often focus on physical milestones and how a child learns, but in actual fact, if we build social and emotional well-being, a lot of the other stuff will naturally follow. So, some of the really important milestones that we should be actually focusing on is creativity and imagination. We know that if we instill creativity and imagination in early life, people will actually grow up as more imaginative and creative and innovative problem solvers as adults. So, if we want innovative adults, you've got to have imaginative children. And that includes things like play in all its forms, that free play, not something that's part of an online game that's already made up for you, but just being out in nature and making up your own games. That's one thing that helps to stimulate imagination and gives children the capacity to then solve it in their own way, to work things out for themselves. That is where we start getting the first beginnings of mastery and agency in those early years when kids just have a go at something, or even if it's quite a silly little game, this is the beginnings of problem solving. Emotional regulation as well has to be focused on in the early years, as well as socialization, building those calm, gentle, soft relationships. And certainly for me as a grandmother now, understanding the importance of having that calm approach with my grandchildren, I just love it. And I see the impact that it has. And I think that a lot of our kids miss out on that. They miss out on that generational aspect to parenting, having their grandparents and great-grandparents around to give that buffer to their parents. And of course, this then builds our resilience throughout life. I think if our social and emotional development is successful, then all of the other aspects of learning and development will follow. It'll be far easier to learn to read, to settle at school, to follow instruction, if you actually feel really good and happy and know who you are. So if we're successful in early childhood, we are far more likely to tolerate later adversity and be successful in life across all developmental domains. And that's what we want to see. We want to see kids not just struggling to get there, but to flourish all the way along and have happy and fulfilling lives. If we look at the science of well-being, then we actually have to understand that it's not as straightforward as just learning. Music, art, dancing, singing all have a biological basis to improving our well-being and our health. It helps to put us in good moods, it helps us to regulate our emotions, and it contributes to our sense of joy in life. Imagination and play lays the foundation for innovative problem solving, as we've already discussed, and storytelling helps to improve development through creating resilience and insight and identity. It assists in developing extensive memory systems, which is very good for aging. So the more creative networks we have as kids, the less we're going to suffer from that cognitive decline and dementia in old age. And our storytelling is different. Our storytelling is not instructional. Our storytelling is about self-autonomy. It's about creating problem solving and insight. So the child can learn and think about the story, think, oh, that's how they did it. I wonder what I would do. And then they can think about what the solution they would apply. And this builds that sense of self-reliance and autonomy, which is very, very important and is now being studied to show that that's the most effective form of parenting, to build in early autonomy and self-reliance. And that's what we've always done historically in culture. And of course, ceremonies and ritual create a collective experience. It helps people feel connected, and it creates a sense of community safety and that sort of collective response. It helps with meaning, with transition at various points in development, and it also gives you a reflective moment, which is like a moment of mindfulness, which also helps the mind to settle, the emotions to settle, and it gives us those nice, pleasant feelings. We also know that knowing country creates health and well-being through establishing rich systems of navigation, those rich neural connections that we always talk about, and the associative learning that comes from that. Being in nature also reduces angry feelings. It increases your endorphins to give you a pleasant sense and feeling. It reduces your blood pressure, so I should get out to nature a bit more, and gives you a natural state of relaxation. So these things that we just do naturally as part of ways of knowing, being, and doing, which have been built up for thousands of years, have a very strong scientific basis to them. And of course, some of this stuff now has a new name like eco-psychology. We just call it ways of knowing, being, and doing. And of course, multi-generational living improves children's empathy. It assists in emotional and social connection, but it also assists old people to age and have that sense of generativity by seeing the younger generations come forward. So it's important for the beginning and the end of life to have connection so that people can understand how it all works and grow up with that. And it also assists in that end of life as well. So these were the things that we naturally did, and we shouldn't shy away from them. These were really important for our life and well-being, and they still are today. And now people are coming back to what we used to do because it's now been proven by science, but it's actually what we've always known. So we have to move away from focusing on just how to mend trauma and moving into how we re-establish our ways of knowing, being, and doing, which protects our well-being. So we do have to have trauma-informed responses because we all carry that transgenerational trauma load. Moving away from what has happened, from what is wrong with you, to what has happened, understanding what we've been through, making sense of it, giving it a context, and having some healing services around that. And I think part of that is creating safe journeys for all of us and safe relationships as we navigate our way through life, through services, through development with our kids. So if we think about, that trauma load, then how do we create the recovery for that as a natural part of parenting and well-being for children? So if we think about the powerlessness and lack of control that was very much part of transgenerational trauma, then we have to flip that over into making sure we're actually showing and living self-determination and good community governance. If children see their parents in positions of power and control of their own lives, then they will understand what self-determination is. If we think about the trauma and the helplessness, that sense that, no one's going to help us and that we're incompetent, we have to turn that around to becoming more resilient, becoming more capable, and building in those positive factors in terms of how we develop that problem solving. And then in terms of the loss and grief and that disconnection, so that sense that life is somewhat futile and hopeless, we have to build in those rich connections to nature, to family, to community, to culture, to spirit, to identity, all of those things that we talk about in that social and emotional well-being wheel. So if we think about how we move children from a sense of powerlessness and families from a sense of powerlessness to self-determination, then we need to look at empowerment across all ages. We can't wait until they're teenagers to be empowered. We have to have self-determination in action with their parents, and showing that role model really in early life to enhance knowledge skills for kids, to actually explain things to children so they know what's going on. They often know what's going on anyway, but we just don't explain it well enough to them. And so they make up their own conclusions as to what they think is happening. We need to enhance problem solving, so that imaginative play early in life, where they can be creative, where they can play out scenarios and work it out for themselves, promote that early autonomy and self-reliance, build confidence, value children's, not just young people's opinions, value children's opinions as well. We don't always need parents to speak up for children. You can ask a 4 or 5-year-old what they think about something, and you might find that some of the answers are very interesting. And we also need to make sure that children are involved in decision making from a young age as well. Not anything that's too stressful, but giving them some choice, listening to what they want, listening to what they'd like, and allow them to be heard. There's no point in waiting until they're 14 or 15 if they've never felt valued or heard before. It's a little bit late to start doing that when they're older. And let them have a go at leadership. Let them have a go at taking a turn, being in control of something, and see how they manage. And then support them if they struggle with it. Support them and help them to understand how to do it well. And then how do we move from that sense of hopelessness to a hopeful future, a bright future where children can reach their full potential? So that requires connection across all domains, family, community, that ecological framework we talk about, having connections in the natural world. In Aboriginal culture, children are born into place and purpose right at the beginning of life. That's wonderful. That's a wonderful thing to have. But some of our kids are not living an Aboriginal childhood. They're totally missing out on their right to have an Aboriginal childhood, which connects them to nature, connects them to Mother Earth, gives them a totem, helps them to understand that they have a special place, that they are irreplaceable. No one can take their place in life and culture, that they have place and purpose right from the beginning. And I think that's what all Australian children should actually have, but particularly our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids. We also need to develop a whole of school cohesion as well. Older kids connected to younger kids, that sense of care and connection across the whole school community, and then broader society. How do we make sure that other groups within society also provide support, sporting teams or other groups in communities? And then, of course, that natural ecological connection that we have, taking kids out to country, showing them country, allowing them to develop their navigation skills, giving them their sense of pride in knowing their own country, and giving them that sense of responsibility from early on in looking after Mother Earth and the natural world around us. That will make them very, very compassionate and innovative adults. And then moving from that sense of helplessness, now I can't do anything, I'm not good at anything, to that sense of agency, to give them that power to say, I can do this. I can do this because I have good skills. So enhancing mastery and that personal skill development across all ages, even from the earliest stages of learning how to, tie a shoelace or hop on one foot. Praise children when they master something, because this is a great opportunity into development to say, yes, look how good you are at that, and make sure that it's real and genuine. Kids will know if they're getting false praise. So make sure the praise fits what they're actually achieving. And that will then increase that sense of personal agency as they get into adolescence. And so that sense of responsibility as adults will be much, much stronger. Making sure you're looking at how they're coping, increase their sense of positive coping skills. Also, storytelling helps to improve their sense of identity, finding out who they are through stories, how other people have solved problems through stories will create insight. Our storytelling is not instructional, it actually creates insight. And that's a much better way to learn. And that does promote then early autonomy and self-reliance, which we've already talked about. And support the development of identity. Make sure kids know who they are. That sense of personal competence, being able to describe who they are and their qualities. And of course, you can use totems in that way as well to be very quite therapeutic in terms of some of their strengths about who they are and their capability. So less instruction, more exploration, more insight. So that children at the end of all of that can say, I know who I am. I know that I can do things and I will do things because I am capable. And that's what we want children to be. So, how do we cradle our children safely into the future? If we're able to achieve those different elements of self-determination and that sense of power and control over their life, that sense of connection so that they feel that there's a hopeful future, and also that sense of personal competency, that's how we're going to safely cradle our children. Now, I'd like to finish with a story that's based around how we build our mountain of well-being. So, how do we build those strong foundations so that we can always shine a light onto our children's well-being? Gecko was an adventurer. He loved exploring and finding new places and had a great deal of knowledge about how the earth was put together. Whenever he returned from a journey, he insisted on telling everyone about his travels. The animals, however, grew tired of hearing his stories and told him he should be staying with them instead of gallivanting around the countryside. But Big Rock felt sorry for Gecko. He loved Gecko's silly stories and often sat with Gecko on the top of the hill, gazing out across the meadows, wondering what may lie beyond the horizon. Gecko and Big Rock loved lying in the sun, and during the day and at sunset, Big Rock glowed and sparkled from all the heat he had absorbed into the crystals surrounding his heart. Because of this, Gecko stayed close to Big Rock at night to keep warm. They became great friends and often talked of having a great adventure together. But one day a great cold descended upon the earth. The sky turned grey, and the sun seemed to completely disappear. Snow started to form across the earth and the sky and the rivers, and oceans became still, trapping the water creatures beneath a blanket of ice. The birds and animals were worried. They had never known anything like this before. It was even too cold for Gecko to venture outside, and one day he got frostbite on his toes, even just visiting Big Rock. Big Rock was also worried, as he needed the sun to warm the crystals in his heart. Something had to be done. All the birds and animals got together for a meeting. The birds suggested flying through the clouds to make a path for the sun to shine through. The next day, the strongest birds flew together in an arrow formation high into the sky. But the clouds were so thick with frost and snow, the birds could not get through no matter how many times they tried. They fell back onto the frozen earth, exhausted and cold. Big Rock had been listening and watching and wanted to help. He told everyone of a way to break through the clouds. If we get all the biggest and strongest rocks of the world together, they can form a mountain high above the earth, and that will pierce the clouds and let the sun come through. How are we going to find enough rocks to build a mountain? Asked the animals. Well, I know where all the rocks are, said Gecko. I made friends with all of them on my travels. I'm sure they will help. It's far too cold for you to travel, said the animals. How will you survive? So all the animals got together and offered warm clothing, fur, and feathers to keep Gecko warm. The next day he ventured out to find the biggest rocks across the landscape. But only after a few days he had to return. He was almost frozen and would have to be nursed back to health before he could try again. I must go back out, said Gecko. No, said the animals, it's too dangerous. We'll have to think of something else. But Gecko was brave and very determined to find the rocks. That night, Gecko and Big Rock talked together about what they could do. I think I can help, said Big Rock. I still have some heat left in the deep crystals around my heart that can keep you warm on your journey. I will put them in a special pouch for you to keep close to your heart. It will give you the strength you need and the warmth you need to complete your journey. Gecko was very grateful to Big Rock and knew of the deep sacrifice Big Rock was making to help him and the others. Gecko tucked the pouch of warm crystals into the fur jacket Kangaroo had made him to wear and set off to gather as many rocks as he could. All the rocks were surprised to see Gecko in a fur jacket, but they were very happy that he had come to help. And they were also happy to come back with him. They had been very worried and didn't know what to do. Soon rocks from all over the world began arriving and gathered at the top of the hill. All the birds and animals worked together with the rocks to build the mountain. Big Rock was too ill to take his place with the others because of the deep scar that was created from giving Gecko the crystals, and this had left him weak and brittle. The mountain grew higher and higher, forging its way through the clouds. But when the final rock took its place, it was not quite tall enough to reach through to the sun on the other side. Everyone was so upset. But Gecko summoned up all of his courage and bravely made his way to the top of the mountain. He stood as tall as he could on his little legs. He reached up through the clouds, stretching out his arm as far as he could. He was holding the pouch containing the warm crystals from Big Rock. When the crystals broke through the icy clouds, rain fell, melting away the frost covering the earth. The grey clouds lost their colour and quickly disappeared as mist into the sky. The sunlight found its way through and warmed the earth, and a beautiful rainbow settled over the landscape. All the animals cheered and the rocks rumbled in great relief and celebration. Gecko scampered down the rock as fast as his little legs could carry him. He knew he had to help his friend. Big Rock was sitting by himself at the top of the hill. He was cold and weak. Gecko gave him back the pouch and the crystals were returned to their rightful place in Big Rock's heart. It took some time, but eventually Big Rock got his strength back. From then on, the mountain stood tall forever in the clouds, so the sun always had a pathway to the earth to warm the landscape. None of the animals ever complained about Gecko's adventures again. Instead, they often helped him to pack a special bag for his travels. Gecko and Rock remained good friends, and Rock still loves hearing Gecko stories together about and remembering the time that they saved the world and each other. So I think what we have to do now is build our mountain of well-being for our children with those big rocks for the foundation. What's going to be the strongest way to build that mountain? And how do we make sure we continue to shine a light on the well-being of our children, because that is what is going to keep us, our future, safe. So the foundations for a stronger future are going to be creating the right story within strong relationships, understanding context through a cultural lens, a responsive service system, competent care, collaborative systems, a compassionate society, building in that self-determination, that sense of connection to nature, to each other, as well as to the broader society. And then thinking about how we make sure our kids know who they are and feel strong and happy and safe within nurturing relationships. And then we can say we did a good job and we protected our children's well-being and they reached their full potential. Thank you. So let's reclaim our social and emotional well-being for our children. We have so much to choose from, so much to offer. Let's move from surviving back to flourishing, understanding that there's a transgenerational load that we all carry. But let's not focus on the deficit. Let's focus on the strengths that we have, because that is what is going to carry us through to the next generation. Thank you.
My name is Muriel Bamblett and I'm CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Child and Community Agency. My people are Yorta Yorta, Jatarung, Bunurong and Tangarong. Today I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are on. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations people present with us today. Our sovereignty has never been ceded. This land is and will always be Aboriginal land. The Victorian Aboriginal Child and Community Agency, VACA, of which I am CEO, is Victoria's largest organisation providing child and family welfare in Victoria. VACA has supported children, young people and families in the community for over 47 years through our vision of self-determination, live, experience and be. We exist to support culturally strong, safe and thriving Aboriginal communities. We deliver over 80 programs across Victoria, including child and family services, family violence, support for stolen generations, child protection, cultural strengthening programs, mental health, financial justice, redress support, early years and homelessness. I'm not going to go through the data today because I think most of you would know it. The continued rise, however, of the numbers of Aboriginal children in care is being driven largely by poverty, transgenerational trauma, family violence, mental health, homelessness, alcohol, drug and substance misuse. We know that these factors significantly impact on the health and parenting ability of our parents, which directly correlates to the health, education and development of children. In Victoria, approximately 20 to 30% of Aboriginal households are living with incomes below the poverty line. On top of this, many have issues which are going untreated because of a lack of services or a lack of trust in services. There is no indication that these issues will abate over time. Indeed, there is a clear trend to the contrary. Clearly, these factors will have a bearing on the outcomes for children experiencing them. A poor start in early childhood means many children will struggle to catch up if they do so at all. In the rest of my presentation, I want to highlight how we as a Child and Family Welfare Service are trying to work with vulnerable families and children within the constraints of legislation, policy and funding to undo the legacy of years of neglect and failings by successive governments. VACA has over 800 children who are in our care. We have a further 400 on guardianship. Therefore, our role in protecting children, we need to respond and work with families along the parenting continuum. We see children born with significant health and developmental issues where their little lives will entail a litany of support services. We are dealing with parents suffering generational removal for whom we are their family. Children we work with have complex needs, Our placement needs to support the needs of children. At the extreme, we have children that are born of drug-dependent parents suffering themselves from withdrawal, children with disability, developmental delay. All of this doesn't end with just placing children. We need to work with carers to support the children, to support their needs. We also work very hard at reunification and restoration to engage and work with parents to address often a multitude of protective concerns. Historically funded for the tertiary end of the system, we have been able to change the way we work through the programs I am going to speak to later. But firstly, I did want to really say that something that we're very proud is really our commitment to shifting the relationship. So for too long, our people have been at the whim of governments. What we're doing is we're now leaning towards the idea of big auntie energy. Using the philosophy of big auntie energy, we seek to apply power and authority based in love, responsibility and commitment. We take inspiration from big auntie energy, reflecting the way community has always stepped in to stand between children and risk. We believe in truth-telling with love and kindness. We are not shy of a tough conversation. We see parents for who they can be, not for their faults, but we do not minimise what needs to change. We're always looking out for the little ones and doing what needs to be done to keep them safe. We believe in families and motivate them to dig deep. We will strive to assert our statutory authority wisely in a way that does not step on or step over the rightful roles of Aboriginal families and communities in the care and protection and guidance of our own children. I'm going to finish on 4 programs and go through them very quickly that we run to strengthen parenting and address trauma. The first is culturally imprinted supported playgroups. We provide activities which promote healthy development, strengthen identity and cultural awareness, support and strengthen families by connecting them to community, strengthening intergenerational links, providing parenting advice and support, and link children and families to universal services where required. We use the playgroups to supervise access to support children return home. The playgroups have been well attended and provide fine and gross motor skill activities for children. We deliver activities and resources encouraging literacy, numeracy and language skills. Children participate in dancing, storytelling, music and art activities. Children develop their individual storybooks. Children have a developmental milestones checklist. Our playgroups are also an opportunity for discussions with parents on child development, child rearing, where we can link them into family support, discuss health, and a range of other topics raised by parents. Our playgroups support successful transition to kindergarten and school. The second program aims to stem the flow of unborn and newborn removals. We have introduced bringing up Aboriginal babies at home, where we employ a maternal and child practitioner who delivers a case management approach to support healthy pregnancy and prevent our babies from being removed. The third program is VACA's Cradle to Kinder program, which gives young mums and dads and their burised babies a great start on their journey from pregnancy to preschool. We support young Aboriginal women who are pregnant and experiencing stressful life experiences like financial pressure, social isolation, and limited support while being pregnant. We provide intensive support to young women from pregnancy or within the first 6 weeks up to birth, up until their child reaches the age of 5 years of age. All 3 programs I've covered have a focus on connecting with family, community and culture, and use Aboriginal practice frameworks. Lastly, I want to talk about the program we're doing in family violence. We know that family violence is one of the key drivers of Aboriginal children being removed from their family home. We have developed specific programs and supports for children and families experiencing this devastating issue, but also other trauma issues. We have broadened our responses and understanding by coming up with appropriate treatment responses for our children. It is now widely understood that relational trauma and relational poverty require relational healing. Children cannot heal in isolation. Similarly, cultural abuse and disconnection from culture requires cultural connection, cultural strengthening, and cultural healing. Intergenerational trauma needs intergenerational healing. Community trauma needs community healing. Historic trauma means we need to heal our relationship with our past, to heal today and into the future. So one of the people that do this work are VECA's healing team, and it's a central point for the development across VECA of an integrated, culturally appropriate and trauma-informed approach to working with our families, children and young people. We undertake trauma-informed psychosocial assessments of children, promote trauma-informed approaches to understanding the needs of Aboriginal children in VECA's care. We undertake theoretical development work to integrate culturally appropriate Aboriginal healing ways. We provide training to VECA staff and provide leadership across our organisation to implement trauma-informed therapeutic practice into our work. And the key principles that we have include holistic healing, culture as treatment, family strengthening, culture as resilient, and empowerment model. So ensuring the healthy cognitive, social and emotional development of our children and young people merits the highest priority of every responsible government, organisation, community, family and individual for the sake of raising healthy children worldwide. Positive early childhood development is critical. We need to begin earlier in educating and supporting families, parents and carers of children. The family environment is the key to nurturing environments for our children. If they don't have this, or if they are in fact have a toxic family environment, their chances of a healthy lifestyle are at risk. We do need to do better, and that's what keeps me going at VECA. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation to speak on this important topic. It is always a wonderful opportunity to speak alongside giants who have dedicated their lives to the well-being of our children. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that I am recording this from Tharawal country and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I would also like to acknowledge the various lands that you all join us from today. I'm going to try to be as efficient as possible. There is a lot to be said on these topics, and there are countless Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, other Indigenous and non-Indigenous thought leaders contributing to this topic about how we nurture our children's futures. I'm not going to be able to refer to all of them or to adequately honour all of their work in the next 10 minutes or so, but I am going to try to make a couple of key points. First, that development is a function of the physical and relational environment, and that these environments are organised by culture. Second, to raise critiques about how psychology, as a discipline, constructs and responds to issues of mental health. And finally, to flag how the social and emotional well-being model offers a different perspective, one that offers alternate opportunities to promote well-being. I feel like that first claim is not that controversial. I'm sure many of us who sat through undergraduate developmental psychology, for example, remember being taught about the long debates about nature or nurture, and the resolution of most modern models that kind of settled on, well, it's a bit of both. A lot of literature on brain development and psychosocial development make those points and explore some of the mechanisms by which the mechanisms for that. And I'm a big fan of the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard and their fantastic resources, which have done a great job at bringing together much of the existing developmental research. And I encourage people to check out those resources. But I want to focus on a couple of key points. Development is an iterative process, building skills and knowledge through experience. Further, this iterative process is scaffolded relationally. This scaffolding is important in at least two directions. First, parents, caregivers, older siblings, cousins, all play a role of shaping development, building new skills on the foundations of previous skills. Second, they also play a critical role in buffering the developing brain from toxic stress. A little strain is a good thing. It's how we build muscles, it's how we develop skills, it's how we build our capabilities. But too much, overwhelming stress undermines our ability to develop and master new skills. And it calibrates our stress response system to autonomic responses, that fight, flight, freeze kind of response. Now, research has made clear that living in this toxic stress harms us. It comes to rest in our bodies in ways that undermine our well-being. So, having established the critical role of the physical and the relational environment for development, I want to move next to the role of culture. Researchers like Super and Harkness argued that culture organizes this developmental environment. And that's wrapped in these notions of social expectations, how we think about parenting, for example, and a whole range of other features. Certainly, part of the arguments in education and other sectors refers to the way that dominant cultural perspectives are built into our very systems and structures, perpetuating those views, those perspectives, and marginalizing others. Now, I've always tended to explain this with an example that many of us would immediately recognize. That moment, I'm sure it's happened to all of us, when a small child falls at a playground. And you see that split second that they kind of look up before they've quite worked out how to respond. They look for their caregivers. They look for the people that they came with to help them work that out, to help them work out how upset they should be, how worried, how frightened, how they should react. And look, I appreciate this is often a complex set of circumstances. I'm not talking about when they've got a compound fracture of their arm or something as a result of the fall. I'm talking about that minor fall. And some parents, because of their own beliefs about parenting, built on their experiences and their cultures, shape that response. We have some parents that the moment that child hits the ground, they are all action. They sweep them up in this swirl of movement and concern. There's really high levels of emotional arousal. And we might see a similar response from the child, an initial high level of emotional arousal that's then buffered quite quickly by proximity and nurturing care from their caregiver. And sometimes, based on different perspectives of childhood and parenting, we see a different response. We might see a parent kind of acknowledge the fall. They're sitting there watchful. They meet the child's eyes, but in a more subdued way, communicating something different. And we might, over time, see a more subdued response from the child too. Those two examples are not to present a judgment position. And obviously, we all recognize that there should be a level of match between the event and the response from parents. But we also acknowledge that the nature of that response is shaped by our different cultural perspectives, our beliefs about parenting, about social behaviors, about how we express emotions, how we respond socially to the emotional expressions of others. And part of the role of parenting is to communicate those patterns across generations. And I think a really powerful way that this was expressed was from someone that you heard from earlier, Auntie Muriel Bamblett, coming at this from a slightly different angle, particularly commenting on how we understand the best interests of a child in the context of child welfare. And she said, and I quote, "Cultural identity is not just an add-on to the best interests of the child. We would all agree that the safety of the child is paramount. No child should live in fear. No child should starve. No child should live in situations of neglect. No child should be abused. But if a child's identity is denied or denigrated, they are not being looked after. Denying cultural identity is detrimental to their attachment needs, their emotional development, their education, and their health. Every area of human development which defines the child's best interests has a cultural component. Your culture helps define how you attach, how you express emotion, how you learn, and how you stay healthy. And I think what's really has always stood out to me in that quote is that critical role that culture plays in shaping not just the developmental environment, but actually the outcome of those developmental processes, how you attach, how you express emotions, how you learn, and how you stay healthy. So we have this notion of early childhood and through adolescence, setting the foundations for later well-being. And we see that early calibration then shapes future development, shapes the way we engage in our social environments, our engagement and response to risk or uncertainty, which is a big part of adolescence, but also represents the foundations, as Annie Muriel expressed, for identity formation, our sense of who we are. We know from the evidence that these relationships and environments that reinforce and support our identities underpin experiences of well-being. And this is important when we start to consider challenges to well-being or mental health, as critiques of psychology as a service and as a discipline show. And again, if you're interested, I encourage you to check out some resources on this. I really like the US podcast Mad in America, Rethinking Mental Health, which has great discussions exploring some of these critical perspectives. One of those recent ideas was a conversation with Jeff Sugarman, who has challenged psychology to consider its commitment to social justice. And this is not a new idea for Indigenous peoples who have a long record of challenging not just psychology, but the helping professions and their role in colonialism. In a 2019 paper with Erin Thrift, they explore the neoliberal tendencies of psychology, which they write, quote, has a tendency to cast social and political issues as individual problems. And I really like the way that they write about this. They said, quote, a widespread error in psychology is that failing to recognize the constitutive force of our socio-political and economic institutions has led to fixing features of persons to human nature rather than to the institutions within which they become persons. They further note that the mutual benefit of that stance. Psychology lends apparent legitimacy to individualist constructions that protect the social and political institutions from scrutiny regarding the harms that they create, while positioning psychology as the discipline best placed to service those individually affected people. So as they frame it, to help individuals adjust to injustice, which is a long way from addressing injustice. And I think this is where the social and emotional well-being model offers a strong alternative. And I'm not suggesting it is unique in doing so. However, models like the social and emotional well-being model explicitly challenge these kind of neoliberal individualist narratives by including social, political, and cultural determinants in their construction of individual and collective well-being. It means too that we look in different places for solutions. Certainly, the point of Sugarman and colleagues is that if our understanding of mental health goes beyond merely individualized and medicalized models, then our approach to promoting well-being isn't just focused on bucking up those individually affected and perhaps holding them responsible if the treatment doesn't work, but should also consider the structures and institutions that shape our lives. The social and emotional well-being model reminds us to consider the individual and the context of their environment with a particular focus on connections, the relationalities, the relationships to people and place and being. And there are particular dimensions to this in adolescence, as young people spend perhaps less time under the direct supervision of their parents and more time in public spaces. How we structure our public environments to continue scaffolding positive development and pro-social development is critical to the well-being outcomes we achieve. How we do so communicates plenty to young people about their place in their community, and we need to consider how we create environments that enable everyone in our community to belong and to thrive individually and collectively. We can't just focus on our responses to individuals, our treatments, our individualized treatments, what Professor Chandler described as redeeming one lost soul at a time, but how we create more just societies where all kids can thrive and where we might all benefit from the diversity and the renewal that they bring. It's why so much of our work focused on child and adolescent well-being is actually focused on those around them, making sure their parents and their families are well equipped to provide a responsive relational and physical environment that continues to scaffold their development and buffer potential stress. We talk about schools and public places that are welcoming to children and adolescents. It's all part, in my view, of upholding our part of the social contract, because the context we create for our young people is the one that shapes them, as Thrift and Sugarman noted. And so if we're concerned about some of the challenges that our young people face, their experiences of anxiety or mental ill health, about social inclusion or pro-social behaviours, if we want to change their trajectories, we need to change the institutions in which they become persons. If we want thriving adolescents, we need to build the environments and the structures that enable adolescents to thrive, from perinatal responses and early childhood foundations, inclusive and responsive schools, but also in our public spaces, as well as our broader structures. And recognizing that it's not just about my children and your children, but recognizing that we have a shared stake in all of our children and what they represent to our future as a nation. And that is something that's baked into the social and emotional well-being model, that the social and political determinants are a critical part of the connections that shape and scaffold development from early childhood right through adolescence and young adulthood. I think I've already taken up too much of your time today. As I say, this topic is massive and there is much more that we could talk about. But I want to thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. I want to extend my thanks, and I'm sure Gayaa Dhuwi's thanks, to Professor Bamblett and Professor Milroy for their time today, and to all of you for taking the time out of your day to hear about these issues and to engage in the conversation about it. Thank you.